Before we start today, we want to let you know about a new thing we have on So Much Crime, So Little Time. We have a Patreon. If you want to support the show, help us continue to make this awesome content that you love, check out our Patreon, and when you become a paid member, you'll get an early preview of the shows that we're going to discuss, and then you can listen ahead of time and be in the know. Plus, you'll also get access to some bonus content that is available only to members.
Join us on patreon.com/so much crime, so little time. The link is also in our show notes.
Why would a woman who suffered years of abuse before finally fighting back plead guilty instead of claiming self-defense?
And what happened after she was sent to prison on a 15-year sentence?
We're discussing the case of Deven Gray as we recap the podcast Blind Plea on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee. And before we start today, warning, there will be spoilers in this episode for the 2023 podcast Blind Plea.
If you haven't listened to Blind Plea yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
You'll also find a link to Blind Plea in our show notes.
But if you're ready, let's get to our discussion. All right, Dee. We're going to break this up a little bit. We should talk first just a little bit about what happens in the show. There are a bunch of episodes. It's a pretty long podcast. This is longer than most of the other ones that we've covered. So
we've got 10 episodes, or we've 11 episodes in total, ranging from 45 minutes to just over an hour. And yeah, let's go through the broad strokes of this story.
All right. So first thing we're going to talk about is episode 2. So we covered episode 1 last time. Episode 2 is called Someone is Lying. And this episode is basically recordings of the interrogations that happened the day after the murder occurred. There's also a bonus episode, which is essentially it's like a 10-ish minute bit of Deven's interrogation, which we hear a lot of that in episode 2. This is just a little bit slightly expanded version of that.
Yeah. So the overarching plot for this episode, as I see it, is that there are 3 sides to every story. And I think that's what they're really trying to tell here. So we start off focusing in again on the 911 call. We heard snippets of it in the first episode. Then we hear Deven's story, how Deven is speaking to Dan Melhoff, who is the lead investigator on the case. And then we hear from Alexis, who, if you'll remember at the end of episode 1, we hear a little snippet into someone else saying, that's not what happened. It was Deven that had the gun. So we hear Alexis's side to the story. Before this episode, we don't know who Alexis is. Turns out she is John's other girlfriend. So, Jeff, what do we want to talk about in this episode?
Yeah, this episode had a lot going on. I think there's we're going to talk about some of the other episodes in groups, but this one I think is a standalone one because it's just so densely packed with information about the case, information about the crime. And I don't know, I had a lot of notes on this one, I think, as well as just we learn a little bit more about the construction of the podcast, right? Like if I can step back for a second from the case, we learn that Liz Flock, the host, she kind of goes through her process of researching the case, which becomes very relevant as she has a conversation with Melhoff, the investigator. The number that stood out to me is she went through 14,000 text messages, which is, I can't even, I have no idea how long that would have taken someone to go through. I mean, not just, skim through, but she's looking for useful material for this case. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting, an interesting look into her investigation while running parallel to an episode about Dan Melhoff's investigation into it. It felt like an interesting comparison because from what I get from this episode, I don't know if you got the same, is Melhoff made a decision very early on in this case what the story was, and he went with it.
Yeah.
And there was no changing his mind on that. Where when we hear Liz's side of how she investigated to tell Deven's story, she is digging. She is digging for relevant information. She is building the story from the ground up. I think they're two very different methods.
Yeah, Melhoff was called to the scene of the crime, like I guess it was like the morning after, because this happened in the middle of the night. And it seemed like I think he references basically making up his mind when he hears the recording of the 911 call that Deven was too calm.
Too calm.
There's an interesting moment where he refers to her as the victim first and then sort of corrects himself, which, I mean, maybe that was like some type of Freudian slip. But yeah, you're right. It was sort of infuriating to listen to because we hear the whole beginning of his interview with Deven where she is clearly in shock about what happened. I mean, she is in a rough physical state, right? She had been in the hospital and she basically comes out of the hospital and is brought into this interrogation room. He reads her Miranda rights. She doesn't have a lawyer present. She's been awake for maybe about 24 hours or so. I mean, she doesn't have a chance to sleep. And then she's just kind of pushed into telling the story. He's seemingly supportive of her, but also, yeah, it seemed like he'd made up his mind very quickly that she was at fault.
I mean, he did note 2 quotes I have from Melhoff in this episode. It was an open and shut case, and it's the easiest one I've ever worked on.
It's the easiest one he's ever worked on, but it sounded like he hadn't worked on a lot of these cases.
Yeah, but regardless, is it the easiest one you've ever worked on because you know she's guilty, because she's telling you she shot the gun? There's no question over that. But there's so many facts brought to him that he point blank ignores.
Right. Yeah.
He says time and time again that there was no evidence that she was abused.
Right. And yet she's severely
She has to
beaten.
go to the hospital for it.
Right.
And he is so dismissive of why she couldn't have done something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why couldn't she just leave?
Right. Yeah. And I think Liz Flock, the host, notes, he says she could have walked out the door at any time if she was really being abused. And she notes that the women who leave end up getting killed. Right. And she was afraid. First of all, where was she going to go? Right. Like, what were her means to get away? She had no resources. She was in this incredibly isolated property in a rural part of Alabama. She had no family, no friends. She didn't always even have access to a phone, let alone to a car.
She probably didn't even know the area. She wasn't allowed out of the trailer most of the time unless John was there. So there is word of there being a forest on site, and in fact it was John's mother who left in the middle of the night from her abusive husband from the same trailer years beforehand when John was 6, and she went through the forest, but she knew the area.
Yeah. No, I think so. And so that this is played kind of in contrast to Alexis's story. So the other woman that John was dating, who seems to get the benefit of the doubt to no end. And she basically presents a completely different story, right? Like, she presents this story that actually it wasn't that John was abusing Deven, it was that Deven was abusing John, and that Deven was always the antagonist in the story. And that she makes some wild claims. Like, she says, well, if John really hit Deven, she'd be unconscious. Yeah. Which she was. She was knocked out. Like, that happened. This was very much an infuriating thing to listen to.
It was infuriating, but what I kept, so Melhoff is ignoring this, assuming immediately that Alexis is telling the truth. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. She's on the phone. She can't actually see what's happening, but because she hears some of these things, she hears gunshots, but she doesn't know who's got the gun in their hand. The annoying thing about this episode for me, which we didn't hear, and I would love to find out, is Melhoff is convinced Deven is lying about being abused that night. But how? So she's covered in bruises and injuries that are fresh. There's no mention of checking John, his hands, or the pistol to corroborate Deven's accounts.
Right.
If he pistol whipped her, which I didn't know that was a thing until this episode, I don't wish to ever know that it's a thing ever again. But surely her DNA would be on the gun, aligning with her story, and then it strengthens her argument of self-defense, or at least that it was him that was the aggressor that night.
Yeah, we know from past things we've listened to. I know this from crime shows that I've watched, that if you want to investigate, like, you look at the bullet holes in the wall and the height of the person who fired the gun. Like, there's ways of assessing. I'm talking about this as though I know anything about this, but I've watched TV shows that do this, and I presume there's some science to this. Like, they could have investigated a little bit more about Alexis's story versus Deven's story. But
yeah,
even if they didn't, how do you trust the person who was just on the phone hearing an argument versus the person who was there in the room?
So I have questions about this as well, because he gives some reasoning for this, but what is so strange is that he does not question her account. He takes it as fact. And I wonder why. Is it because she's a local? They were really cordial with each other at the start, seemed really comfortable with each other.
Yeah.
Is it because she's white? Or is it because he knew them somehow? Because he does refer to John as Jay, which is not something I heard throughout the rest of it.
He does, but he also refers to Alexis by Alexa. Like,
Yeah,
he makes mistakes when he's talking to Liz, which I don't know. It's, like I said, this was frustrating to listen to.
and then the other frustrating thing is we have Henry, who is John's dad, who, if he's going to land on a side, surely he'd be on John's side. And he describes being aware of the domestic violence that was happening in that trailer, being aware of John and what he was doing. He says, Henry says about Deven, I just can't see her shooting him. He says it about his own son has been shot by Deven. And he said, I just can't see her shooting him. Like, it must have been pushed. She must have been pushed so far in order to do this. It just doesn't make sense.
And one other note about Henry. So Henry, who lived on the same property, would note that he would hear them fighting. He would hear John abusing Deven, and he would just turn up his TV. So he didn't have to listen to it, which was just heartbreaking to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
So once we move past this episode, so as we said, we've got this bonus episode. So the bonus episode is Deven being interviewed by Dan Melhoff, that full interview that we hear snippets of in episode 2. It was very upsetting to hear. I feel like you could really feel her vulnerability. It felt a little bit like similar to how we previously have said 911 calls and listening to them feels intrusive.
Yeah.
Part of me felt that this felt intrusive because I really felt the vulnerability. But it was also interesting to hear from the perspective of how Melhoff lulled Deven into that false sense of security. I'm here to support you, and pretended to support her throughout it. It is very upsetting. It is worth a listen, but yeah, go in with that idea. Okay, so moving on to episode 3, 4, and 5. We're going to group these together for a discussion. Basically, episode 3 is more or less about Deven, her life before John, her life with John while they were living in upstate New York.
Yes.
Upstate New York. And then the move to Alabama. Episode 4 is all about John, who he was before this, his life growing up, his relationship with Deven. And episode 5 is called The Other Woman. It's all about Alexis. The story kind of from her point of view. So, Jeff, start me off. What are your thoughts?
the first thing I want to bring up is that something I didn't know when we started listening to this was that Deven spent a good amount of her childhood. So her parents separated when she was 2. Her mom had a drinking problem, and
Her dad had an affair, and her mom had a drinking problem.
So her mom took Deven and her sister to upstate New York to Saratoga, which is where I grew up, actually. They lived in literally within 10 minutes, 15 minutes of where I spent most of my childhood. So it was funny to hear some of these place names like Saratoga Lake and Ballston Spa and these things. And like, this is where I went to middle school and high school. So I had this kind of immediate like sense of the area, and Deven's sister at one point talks about how people called it like the Saratoga's ghetto, but it really wasn't a ghetto. Like it was actually really nice. And it's like, yeah, there isn't a not nice part of Saratoga, New York. Like it's a very generally pleasant suburban place surrounded by woods and mountains, and it's really beautiful actually. So yeah, I was kind of hooked on that and really like engaged with the story, but at the same time like hearing about how, you know, Deven came from this you know, really difficult situation where she just kind of seemed to want the approval and the love from her parents, which she didn't seem to get from either one. Her dad had very high expectations. Her mother seemed to have a pretty serious drinking problem, and so she sort of like bounced back and forth between the two of them, and both were bad situations for her. It seems like with her mother, it was particularly bad, where she just sort of tried to keep up, and that's how she became a partier. She started drinking when she was too young, and which is how she ends up with John, right? Like,
but she's also looking for validation and has a need for someone to give her, like, control her. I think it seems like as a child growing up, she might have felt out of control because there was no maybe structure to her life, and she was seeking someone to help her and guide her and take control, and she found someone who wanted to fully control her.
Right. So we get into John's story, which, I mean, similarly had...
So similar. It's really similar. It felt in both cases, in both Deven and John's upbringing, there really didn't seem to be any model of a healthy relationship for either Deven or John to aspire to, other than in Deven's case, her grandparents seem to have this absolutely beautiful relationship, but her grandmother died when Deven was 14. 14. And then she ended up caring for her granddad when she was 16. She was there was am I right with ages?
He had
there?
prostate cancer.
She ended up having to move into a carer's role, which her granddad seemed to dislike because it wasn't meant to be like that for her. And then, so for a while it seemed like Deven was on the right track, maybe because she had such a solid, loving relationship with her grandparents and could see a really healthy relationship to aspire to. But I think once they both passed away, it really seemed to... the bottom fell out of it all, and it seemed that she didn't feel like she had anywhere.
Right. I think that's right. I think there's also, I mean, it's alluded to sort of not just the cycle of violence and the lack of any type of good role model, but also like addiction, right? Like her mother's seemingly has this alcohol addiction, and Deven seems to be caught up in that world, including to once she graduates from high school and she tries to go to college, and she has a really rough year at college where alcohol becomes a problem. She gets hospitalized twice, and then she drops out after her first year. And ends up back in New York, back drinking, and this is where, you know, she ends up with John. So it's a tough story.
It really is. The other thing that was interesting within these two episodes in particular, before we move on to talk about Alexis, is Deven calls John's mom from the cop car that brings her from the trailer on the morning of the shooting to the police station. And seemingly John's mother, is it Christine or Christina?
Christine Leone.
Christine is feeling compassion for Deven at this point.
Yeah.
And then something seems to flip. Apparently, she said she heard the true story. So whether it's Alexis she believes, we don't really know, but something definitely seems to flip. And what I do notice in episode 4, John's mom is she seems quite harsh about how different the scenario that Deven and John were in was to what had happened to her on the same land, whatever, 20 odd years beforehand, when she ran away from her husband.
Yeah.
And Liz notes, which I found interesting, was how this is apparently pretty common with domestic abuse victims, that when they hear of someone else and what they went through, they have a harsher outlook on it.
Yeah. And yeah, Christine, I don't know if it says something about, I don't know what it says, but it's something that struck me that, yeah, Deven is in the police car after killing John, and she doesn't call her sister. She doesn't call her dad. She calls John's mom.
She calls John's mom. Yeah. Which shows the relationship there and the trust she had, that she would understand.
Well, also, I think it shows that Deven says this herself many times, like she loved John, right? Like she
says it at the end. She says it before, while she's in prison, how much she misses him and how much she's angry at him for what she inevitably ended up doing.
Right. Yeah. We should talk about Alexis. So this is episode 5. It's called The Other Woman. And like you said before, this is basically Alexis' story about how she ended up meeting John and just about their relationship, which was happening essentially on the side while John was, living with Deven, right? Like from Alexis's point of view, John and Deven were split up, but no one else seemed to think that.
Nope. It was an interesting episode. One negative I have about maybe this episode, and I alluded to it slightly in episode 1. I wasn't sure how it was going to play out, and my mind has changed as I went through the series, but I'll give you my thought process as I was listening to episode 5. It kind of irked me how much we heard Liz Flock, the host's, opinion on this. It felt the way Melhoff totally believed Deven totally believed Alexis over Deven. It felt that Liz completely believed Deven over Alexis and had no time for her story. And we got that opinion here. And as I was listening to this episode, it felt it was good to have this episode, and I totally understand why Liz Flock feels like this and feels that frustration and really doesn't understand, because the case is pinned on Alexis. The entire case is built around Alexis's story.
Right.
But in a way, having it here to me having that opinion felt like it weakened Deven's case for innocence, or Deven's side of the story. I felt if we heard episode 5 with no opinion, just factual, with no opinion from the host, it wouldn't have weakened it. But with the little pieces of opinion I felt that went through, whether it was tone of voice or comments throughout, I felt that weakened Deven's plea.
That's a really interesting point. I don't know that I thought about that, but now I'm looking through my notes from this episode about Alexis, and I realize that if John was abusive to Alexis, we don't know about that. I don't think that's ever mentioned.
No.
The only sort of like outside commentary we get about Alexis, there's a quote from Ethan, who is John's friend, who talks about how he didn't trust Alexis. And it's almost like we get more kind of corroborating evidence of why Alexis is untrustworthy.
Which I don't dispute. I don't dispute it. And I, for one, believe Deven. I'm not sure that I think Alexis is telling. I think Alexis is telling the story that she thinks must be true from her relationship and her knowledge of John. I'm not sure if I fully believe that I'm not sure I fully believe that she was out and out to get Deven. I really don't believe that.
I feel like there's an interesting story to be told, and I think this comes up primarily in episode 2, where we're getting all the different interrogation recordings, where you hear the moment where Alexis is brought in to talk with Melhoff, doesn't know that John is dead. And she's very kind of just like happy and just it's a very abrupt tonal shift when she finds out what happens, and obviously she's devastated by this. And then we cut to, I think it's later or a different interview, where now she has this story about what was really happening that night. And I don't know, I guess I didn't think about how is that not presented with some type of like journalistic neutrality? Does it deserve that?
I felt like it should have been, though, because from even just saying those facts and then telling the story that she comes back with, we've spoken time and time again about the weakness of witness testimonies. This is a witness testimony from a step back on the phone. There is no visual. I feel like for the sake of this podcast, I understand, given how everything plays out with the trial and everything, why there would be frustration here. But I feel like I feel like Alexis's story, without any opinion, we could see the cracks for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Liz notes that she didn't. This was an episode she was unsure of doing, wasn't it? Wasn't it this episode that she said that about?
Yeah.
And so that's one thing to note. But like, there was even comments about how Alexis, after the trial, moves back to somewhere,
Ohio,
another state. Yeah. Yes. And gets engaged and gets married within a year or within 2 years. But the way it's even said is dismissive.
Well, and the GoFundMe. She sets up a GoFundMe.
Oh, well,
to raise money after John's death with a $5,000 goal, and then we hear Christine come in, John's mom, who notes, like, first of all, they're kind of making fun of the fact that she only raised $165, and Christine notes, never sent me a dime, which is just another kind of outside perspective on Alexis's untrustworthiness.
Yeah, and that speaks for itself. But the fact that Alexis moves, gets engaged and gets married within a year or two isn't, I don't know whether it was said as a sign of she moved on very quickly, or whether it's said as a sign of, look what Alexis gets to do versus look at what Deven gets to do, and like what happened to her in the years after. I'm unsure. I just felt some of it was unnecessary. And do you know what? Maybe I agree with Liz when she said we weren't sure about whether to do this episode or not. It felt, of all the episodes within this podcast series, it was the one I was least comfortable with.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely agree with that. And you're right, though, that the entirety of the prosecution's case really hinges on Alexis, right? Like, it really hinges on the fact that Deven's motive is jealousy over Alexis.
And that's what we hear in episode 6, 7, and 8. So when we're talking about the trial, we hear that.
Yeah, let's get to those. Should we get to those?
Yeah. So give me your summary of, say, let's go with 6. Nice. So 6 is called, because we're over time.
6 is called Deven's defense, and this one is really about this initial stand your ground claim that Deven puts up, which is basically saying, I mean, this is a law in some states, not all states. This was made famous in 2013, so a few years before this, in the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case, and it fails, right? So and there's data that's presented in the episode about how Black people are 15% more likely to lose stand your ground hearings than their white peers. How it seems like that this law, which is seemingly ostensibly set up to allow people to defend themselves when they feel physically threatened, as one might say Deven was, is biased against domestic violence cases. It seems like it's more set up about white property owners to defend their property and to have a justification for say shooting someone who comes on their property, which is, I don't know, when you talk about infuriating things, like it seems like this exactly is the type of thing that should help domestic abuse victims fight back or not happen what happened to Deven, right? Like that's what this should be for.
Yeah, and what's also interesting in this is Mama Cat, who was John's grandmother, got off after shooting her husband and killing him. Stand Your Ground, from my knowledge, wasn't in place at that stage when that happened, but it worked for there. But this Stand Your Ground seems to have been so, there's so many nearly specific tick the box exercises you have to do to warrant even being considered for this, and one of them is being in immediate danger, and it's not deemed immediate danger if your abuser, who has been beating you up for 4 hours for the last 6-7 years, takes a break from beating you up for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, there was a quote in here: abuse victims don't fight back at convenient times. Which, I mean, yeah, it's true, right? Like you fight back when you have the opportunity, or you get pushed too far,
the energy, or the I don't even know. The adrenaline too. I can't imagine it all. The other focus of episode 6 in particular was hearing how the attorney was not as optimistic as Deven in this, and ultimately he was right. And there were definitely questions raised over the treatment of Deven in comparison to other cases, as you were noting. But one phrase that was said here, and then we hear it throughout the rest of the episodes, I felt like, was she was honest to a fault.
Yeah.
And that maybe was it. And I was wondering, was this in particular to do with the fact that Deven said he lay down on the bed for about 5 minutes and I picked up the gun? Because apparently that 5 minutes of him lying down on the bed is what got it. If she said he lay down on the bed for 10 seconds and I grabbed the gun and I shot him, would they have felt, well, yeah, that was still happening? Like what's their marker in time for it being abusive? Because presumably if he was boxing her in the face when she did it, she might have been more likely to be considered for Stand Your Ground. But the fact that he was lying down and it was in the back of his head.
I think that's right. I think that's brought up a couple times, and I think that's 100%. I think that's 100% right. And there's a lot of other things here, but yes, the two critical facts are, one is not debatable that she shot him in the back of the head. The other is that she said 5 minutes passed, and that 5 minutes seems to be just too long, right? Like she's not in immediate danger because 5 minutes has passed, which is absurd, right? Like it's, considering that
what is her sense of time at that stage? If she said she's been drinking all night, and when she wasn't drinking, she was just getting her head bed in, gunshots going all around, hiding, cowering in a toilet away from her abuser who's shooting a gun randomly around the trailer. What is 5 minutes at that stage?
But I think you're right. I think if she had said 10 seconds went by, it's a totally different case. Different case. Yeah, so we're batching together episodes 6, 7, and 8. So 6 is about the Stand Your Ground claim that fails. 7 is called The Blind Plea, which is the title of the whole podcast. And this is where Deven's lawyer, who is Dan Alexander, convinces her to go with this blind plea concept. And so part of why I was interested in listening to this podcast was because I had never heard of a blind plea. And here we learn about how most people have never heard of a blind plea.
Most people, like even people like lawyers working in other states, like they haven't heard about this. Legal professionals have not heard about this.
Right. And essentially, just to be clear on what this is effectively, Deven pleads guilty to a lesser charge. So instead of murder, she pleads guilty to manslaughter. And murder, if she had gone to a jury trial, she would have had a jury of her peers, which in this case would have unfortunately been mostly older white conservative people, because that's who lives in this county, in Shelby County in Alabama. And so I think her lawyer felt like the odds of her getting a fair trial, getting a sympathetic jury, were low. So so she pleads to manslaughter instead of murder. Instead of a possible sentence of 20 years to life, the maximum sentence is 20 years. So it's probably a 10 to 20 year sentence, but she waives her right to an appeal. And the other thing here, which I think is well covered here, but I think is hard to understate, is what her state of mind is at this point, right? Like she's been in jail now for a while.
She's exhausted.
She is exhausted. She speaks to this, right? Like we hear Deven talk about her kind of state of mind where she is just kind of broken down, weary. She just wants this whole thing to be over with. And I think this gets to the sort of the systemic element of this, where you get defendants who just lose the will to fight, right? Like the system is so sort of stacked against you, and it takes so long that she goes with this idea of the blind plea, which, like we mentioned earlier, means she gets a sentence of 15 years, which in some ways is considered a lenient sentence, because if it was under 16 years, she'll get good time, which allows her to get out of prison in less than the 15 years.
And way quicker. There was a lot in this episode that just, it frustrated me, but then I also it was kind of intriguing. So when I first heard why the lawyer wanted her to take this, it was capped at 20 years. He was afraid that she wouldn't get a fair trial with the jury that would be there. I was like, that's interesting. Okay, I kind of understand his train of thought. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. But then we have Richard Rice at this stage coming in. I'll tell you what, I want him on my side if I ever get in trouble. He seems to know his shit.
So he's a civil rights attorney who has won several stand your ground claims.
And also just knows a lot. And he states, well, why go for the blind plea here? Because even if you brought forward the case, and even if she got 20 to life by an all-white jury, there would be reason to appeal that based on the fact that it was an all-white jury and it was not. He was pointing out all of these reasons how the blind plea was a terrible way to go.
Yeah.
And I just hadn't considered that. Like a blind plea sounds like a terrible thing to do, to be honest, but I understand she explains well her thought process at that stage. And I can kind of empathize and understand it.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't really said in the episode, and maybe I'm wrong here, but yes, first of all, yes, he sounds like the lawyer she should have had. But even if she were to appeal, she's still in Alabama, right? She's still in this state that is the last state to overturn interracial marriage ban. That didn't happen until the year 2000, right? Like this was the last holdout. And you've got a lot of people there who were still voting against that, so yes, those would be the people in the jury. That would be the grounds for appeal. But also, I think it's alluded to that there's never been a black judge.
I have this down being like, WTF. It's 2024 and 2023 when this podcast came out. And we're saying there's never been a black judge in this county? What?
Yeah. So what my point is that, like, yes, she could have appealed, but again, she is so just ready for this to be over, which I've heard in other cases with other people in prison. Particularly, I've heard this from like books I've read of prisoners in the South, black prisoners in the South, who just sort of are resigned to their fate because they understand that the system is stacked against them. They understand that they're not going to get a fair trial. They're not going to get a fair appeal. They're not there's no, yes, we can sit here and say this is how the system should work, but that's not how the system works.
Yeah.
Right? She's going to end up in prison one way or the other. So
Yeah.
why not just get it over with, serve her time, and get out eventually? Which is awful to say, but I think that's
Gotta play
like
the
that's
system.
what she was facing. That's where her head was
Yeah.
at, and I totally I empathize with that. Which is also bolstered by episode 8, which we should get into, which is the parole hearing. So yes, she gets sentenced to 15 years, and then when she first comes up for parole, it goes as you expect, which is badly. Yeah.
My overarching plot for this episode is, how does this work? Hint, it doesn't. This prison system, we're not going to get into it here. I feel like we'd need a whole 17 million podcasts on it, but the prison system is broken here. What is really interesting in this episode, I found, was protests that started about how the parole system is really broken.
Yeah.
And there was work stoppages to obviously stop the cheap labour that was going on in there. But their demands, their 3 of their main demands just seemed, 2 in particular, seemed so low. One was that they wanted oversight for the parole board. Okay, that sounds reasonable. They want mandatory parole criteria the board would be required to follow. Oh, so you want to understand what you have to do in order to get something that you need to get. That's really understandable. Like, these are not high. This isn't high expectations they're having. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a litany of statistics here about, like, there was a August 2022 study about 82% of prisoners should have been released. Only 6% were, right? That's what led to the protest. There's, in the state of Alabama in 2022, 11% of people overall who were parole eligible got out, compared to 41% in New York, which 41% is considered low, but 11% is absurdly low. So, but on top of that, you've got that the state of the prisons in Alabama, this prison in particular, where she was named one of the 10 worst prisons in the country, full of sexual assault, inhumane treatment. Basically, you've got male guards who are completely disregarding the trauma of the women who are there. There's no air conditioning in the summer in Alabama, which I've been to Alabama in the fall, not in the summer, and even in the fall, it was oppressively humid and hot. These seem like just generally inhumane conditions that these women in this prison are having to deal with. And then the fact that when they should be released, they should be getting out, they aren't, for arbitrary reasons. So Deven's parole hearing, the board that oversaw her parole hearing, spent 5 minutes deliberating. 5 minutes.
Not just 5 minutes, but there was new material introduced at that stage. There was 26 pages for them to consider, and it took them 5 minutes.
Yeah. If you want more on this, I highly recommend the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. It's essentially it's a documentary that traces sort of the legacy from the end of the Civil War, the end of slavery, and how much of the South immediately turned around and realized, well, we need that labor replaced, and so let's build up the prison industrial complex, and because even though the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery, it still allowed basically indentured servitude for people who were in prison. So we have all these people who are in prison who are essentially working for nearly free or free, and the system is then just built up and built up and built up to force them to stay there, to put more people into it, and once they get there, to keep them there, which is, I've said infuriating a lot in this episode, but that is especially infuriating.
Yeah. It's like the health system and the prison system. If they're privatized and they're run for money, seems like a bad idea, guys.
And don't even get me started on the health system within the prison system. It's a whole.
So episodes 9 and 10 are all about Deven trying to get out of prison. So more or less from 9 and 10, we're hearing that it's all a bit of a mess in there, which is really putting it mildly, in terms of even paperwork and communication and how things are done. And her family being kept up to date and people she wants to be kept up to date in what's happening. Nobody knows what's going on. There doesn't seem to be alignment. There doesn't seem to be a communication that runs through each of the various systems. But in episode 9, we get a really surprising news that Deven is told at 8 p.m. or something one evening that she's been moved the next day to this lesser... I thought your face was doing something to say that I was doing something wrong.
No, I thought I was going to sneeze.
Okay. So this lesser facility called ATIF, is it?
I didn't write it down.
Okay, some other lesser facility, which most times people move there for about 6 or so months and then they move out. So I'll tell you what, Jeff, 9, 10, 11. And there was one other episode or one other part I think in episode 3. I cried so many times listening to these episodes. I cried at the intro of 9. I cried when Liz and Deven have this call and Liz says, "Can I buy a plane ticket and come and meet you?" After Deven is told that she's going to be let out. And Deven is like, "Of course you can." And she's like, "I can't wait." And they're just this relationship that they have. It's just so beautiful. It's so lovely and it's so raw and it's so emotional. And I feel so this is episode 9, after listening to those, 8 other episodes, I felt really invested in their relationship. And
yeah,
I thought it added a real layer to this series overall to see that develop. And as I said in episode 1, I was a bit unsure of how I felt about Liz's clear lean towards Deven, and was that what I wanted to hear? Like, was that what people want to hear when they're listening to this story? And by the time I get here, I'm like, yes, you do, because you are speaking up for women who are not being heard. That is what you're doing. So her push to Deven is right here. Deven and these other women that are impacted by this, Liz is being a voice for them. So we're not getting a journalistic overview of the case without opinion and without feeling. That's not what this podcast is. This podcast is feeling and emotion and passion about the fact that some people get heard from and get treated in a certain way and other people don't. And for those who don't, I'm going to advocate for them. And I was like, yes, Liz, yes. So I took back everything that I thought beforehand as I got to this stage of it.
Yeah, I think...
Sorry, I went on a rant there.
No, that was great. I think since I've listened to this, I have told so many people about this podcast, and my kind of elevator pitch on this podcast is it's some real tough to listen to things at the front end of it, but it's such an emotionally satisfying end. And these last few episodes, yes, the whole process of Deven getting out of prison is so frustrating, and how much bureaucratic red tape and mess there is. But yeah, that bond that is clear between Liz and Deven, but also just hearing the fact that Deven does get out, right? Like, she does get released. She does get reunited with her family. She does get reunited with her daughter, right? Like, that is so satisfying to know. And she shouldn't have ever been there, right? Like, she shouldn't have ever had to be in prison for any length of time, let alone for the 5 or so years that she was in prison. But one other side note that is a smaller thing, but I want to call out because one of my favorite parts of these last couple of episodes, Janice from the bed and breakfast.
Oh my God, can she go on our list to go and have a drink or a cup of tea or something with her?
Janice is amazing.
I cried again. This is the other time I cried. Go on, tell me.
No, I think I feel like we often really want to just highlight some of these just like everyday heroes who pop into these stories, have their little bit, and then like they're sort of, little like character actors in the broader narrative. And so Janice runs this bed and breakfast where when Liz and her team are trying to go to the prison to meet with Deven, I don't think it's Liz. I think it's actually one of the other people on the podcast
Kristen.
stays at this bed. Sorry.
Yeah, when she's supposed to be released, and then they can't get in touch with Christine, who is John's mum, and they have to tell Christine that Deven is being released early in order for her to be released, but they don't call her.
Right. But okay, so Janice is established in a I think it's episode 9 maybe as just like an all around, like she's the person you meet in the town who just knows everything and is super helpful and is just ready to jump in with whatever you need. And then when Deven gets out of prison, so Liz tried to be there, but because it kept getting delayed, and because Liz also acknowledged like she's very pregnant at this time, Liz can't be there. And Janice is like, I'll go. She's just this person who runs this bed and breakfast in town. She has no connection to Deven. But she's like, not only does she go,
but she says, what would Deven want to do when she gets out? Let me get a list of things she might want to do. I'm going to bring balloons when I'm picking her up. I'm going to bring her new clothes. I'm going to bring her fancy cookies.
I'm going to plan to get her a mani-pedi. Not just balloons. 5 balloons for the 5 years she was in prison that she can then release when she's out of the prison as a symbolic gesture of this transition out of prison, which is, I mean, Janice is everything you want, right? Like,
and then as soon as she meets Deven and they're talking, she said, let's go get a present for your daughter. What do you think she might like? Oh my God, Janice, I want to give you a hug. I want to be your friend.
Yeah. Janice also, so she takes Deven, so after this whole, the cookies, the clothes, the balloons, the mani-pedi, the dinosaur that she gets for her daughter, she takes her to the airport so that Deven can fly home to be with her family. And there's this whole thing with Deven has to wear this ankle bracelet, and the airport security has an issue with this. Basically, they're worried that this is one of those most ridiculous airport security things of like, oh, her ankle bracelet is going to interfere with the airplane, so she can't fly with that. And Janice is the one who goes and gets the prison some representative of the prison to come and take the ankle bracelet off so that she can fly home. I'm
gonna say that was real sound of the prison to send someone down to do that. I didn't expect that. They make her flight. Like, that's actually one thing like that they did real well. I was real surprised about it. It was incredibly sound.
Yeah, I guess if we have one positive mark in the column for the prison system. Yeah,
they took her ankle bracelet off so that she could fly home, even though they should have taken it off before she left so that she could fly home, because they knew she was going to fly home.
Sure. There was also a nice guard when Janice came who took the clothes, made sure that basically that Deven could walk out in her new clothes, and that was a nice gesture. So there are some good people, I'm sure, who work there.
And then we get this lovely bonus episode on life on the outside. Deven, since she got out, is what it's about. She's doing well. She's struggling. She's ambitious. She talks about what she wants to do. And then all of the mad stuff she has to do, like get a social security number, which I didn't realize you'd no longer have one if you went into prison. That wasn't something I was aware of.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting. It's a real different sound even to it. There's a real, it's like, it's got a really different feel to the rest of the podcast. It's very casual.
Yeah.
It's powerful, I think, and it really makes it all real.
I agree with that. I think it gets at some of the things that I think I've certainly heard in other places, certainly like fiction stories. Like, I don't know, I kept thinking of like Shawshank Redemption, which is, I know, kind of like a cliched place to go with this, but those moments when they get out of prison, and like if you've seen the movie when Brooks gets out and has a hard time adjusting, and obviously Brooks was in prison, and it's a fictional movie. It's not maybe the best metaphor for this, but that movie kind of really hit me of like how hard it is for someone to come out of prison. And this episode about Deven, she was in prison for 5 years, but she was so young when she went in, and it's still like it's proportionally a significant part of her life. It's a significant part of her daughter's life. and to have to adjust, to have to be able to, she has to get a job, right? She has to get all this paperwork. She has to be able to get a job, which this touches on this, but it's hard to get a job when you're a convicted felon.
Mm-hmm.
And she's trying to get a job so she can get a place to live, so she can re-get custody of her daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I think this episode is both really kind of heartwarming, but also doesn't gloss over the fact that it's not going to be easy for Deven, right? Like,
no, this
just
isn't a
because she's out
happy
of prison,
ending. It doesn't mean that everything's all bows and whistles and bells and whistles, bells and whistles.
One other thing I want to note from this is Deven is kind of toying with the idea, and I don't remember if this is Liz's idea or Deven's, about whether Deven should go on, like what she should do with her life. And she, Deven is really interested in writing. She talks about being like a motivational speaker to help other women in abusive relationships understand that they're not stupid, they're not weak, that they can get out of those relationships. And like, I hope that she does that, right? Like, so this is recorded fairly recently. I hope that, once she's able to kind of get the stability, get custody of her daughter, like that is what happens for her. Because I think, like, that's a book I would read. Deven's book I would read.
100%.
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah.
All right, Dee.
Wow. It was great.
Final thoughts on this?
It was great. It was moving. It was interesting. It was raw. It was emotional. And it's not a cold case, which is also great because we have done a lot of those. Sorry, that might have been a bit too flippant after all that chat.
As infuriating as so many parts of this story were, like, the arc of this was so satisfying, right? Like, I think it's so easy to get emotionally connected to this story, to find something that resonates with you. I think this may have been one of the most powerful ones that we've listened to, that we've talked about. And
yet I feel like it needs to be promoted more. I feel like I don't know. I'm glad we're doing this here. And I know that's the point of it, is to say, have you heard about this yet? This is so good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good
really
find, Jeff. Good find.
If you enjoyed these last two episodes on Blind Plea and wish that we could keep the conversation going, we have a special treat for you. Our next episode will be an interview we did with Blind Plea's host, Liz Flock. We got the chance to ask her our lingering questions, learn about how the podcast came together, and get updates on what's happened to her and Deven since the show came out last year. It was a terrific conversation, and we're delighted to share it with you.
That's next time on So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Tai. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.